In 2006, a group of artists from Denmark created an art installation in front of the Contemporary Art Centre in Copenhagen. The project involved a military tank from World War II and thousands of knitted squares. The result was a striking example of yarn bombing, and the message was in protest to the war in Iraq. This is my media item. It's by a woman called Marianne Jorgensen. My talk today is about non-violence, and because there is such a large body of knowledge around this concept, I'll be focusing today on protest and persuasion. I'll be using Gene Sharp's There Are Realistic Alternatives and Brian Martin's Paths to Social Change, Conventional Politics, Violence and Non-Violence. I will use them to explain the basic concepts of non-violence, effective non-violent strategies, and how an emerging social movement such as yarn bombing has the potential to create change through protest and persuasion. To look at the role of yarn bombing as a non-violent strategy, I will also look at Jacqueline Wallace's work. It's called Yarn Bombing, Knit Graffiti and Underground Brigades, the study of craftivism and mobility. Non-violence is a peaceful means to bring about change. It is also the restraint from using harm against others. There are two general threads of non-violence, pragmatic and principled. Pragmatic non-violence is used in situations where it is sensible to refrain from using violence, and where more can be achieved through non-violent means. Pragmatic non-violence, while usually aligned with one's ethic code, is not necessarily tied to moral or religious beliefs. Principled non-violence, most famous for Mahatma Gandhi, is an adherence to non-violence due to religious and moral principles and convictions. It is sticking to non-violence no matter the suffering or the violence against you. I propose that we think of the Pink Tank project as a combination of the two. This is because there are so many people involved that it is difficult to discern whether they are using pragmatic or principled violence, non-violence. So let us have a look at violence and non-violence. To better understand the gains and perils of non-violent action, first we have to understand how violence interacts. So violence is ingrained in our culture. It is both socially acceptable and unacceptable. For example, when terrorists, gangs or individuals use violence, it is socially condemned. But when governments, military forces or even freedom fighters use violence, it is seen as acceptable. They may use it to resolve conflict, maintain order or achieve political goals. The combat tank is a symbol of authorized violence. It represents to many people the fight and the noble efforts of our soldiers to gain freedom from oppression, from injustice and against evil. Violence is thought to be the most effective and powerful action to halt bad violence, resolve conflict and punish wrongdoing. When violence is used effectively, the actors appear to have authority, power and strength. As Martin states, when violence is used by governments, it becomes conventional and seems normal. This normalization of violence keeps the power structure intact, and in some cases maintains peace and security. But it is not the only way to achieve peace. Most often, violence is the cause of greater conflict. Therefore, Sharp argues, we must look for alternatives to the way we see and use violence. So this brings us to non-violence. Martin describes it as methods of action that are not violent and that are not conventional politics. He says that non-violent action can be treated as a set of techniques of struggle, melded together into a campaign. Non-violence can also be a way of life, a philosophy or personal behaviour and being. But compared to non-violent action, non-violent methods appear weak and naive. We can imagine that a group exercising violence will not listen to appeals through diplomacy. They will continue using violence as long as it achieves their goals. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent years of bitter, crushing war is an example of persistent, prolonged, authorized violence. The Middle East is seen as a region that is rife with ethnic, political, religious tensions. The terrorist attacks on the US in 2001 gave the pretext to later invade Iraq, a story we are all familiar with. The US felt threatened by terrorist actions and in turn responded with violence. Sharp explains this simply. In situations where fundamental issues are at stake, compromise is not an option. In this case, conflicts are considered acute and people believe it is necessary to wage conflict as strongly as possible. And so the cycle of violence perpetuates. But how can we change this course? What means are available to us, the people? Sharp argues that the true power lies in the support or inaction of society, the cooperation of institutions and people. Throughout history, it can be seen that people have fought in conflicts without involving violence, but rather by using psychological, social, economic, or political methods. Brian Martin analyses the effectiveness of conventional politics, violence and non-violence, in affecting social change. He explains that in many cases, non-violence is the most effective tool available to the greatest range of people. It is interesting that people with stable representative governments, such as ours or in Denmark, are increasingly using unconventional methods to cause social change. Instead of registering complaints or opposition through conventional channels, people are opening a public discourse, a communication that at once creates solidarity and places pressure on the government to listen and implement change. Non-violence is an effective strategy due to accessibility. Yarnbombing can be done by anyone willing to put their hands to work. As Martin says, non-violence is high on participation and is often used by those marginalised by conventional power structures. In countries with representative governments, high participation in non-violent action usually equates with social change. However, in other regimes, involvement in such actions can lead to imprisonment, torture, or death. However, this does not mean that such methods are flawed or that resorting to violence will necessarily solve conflict if non-violence doesn't. As Martin states, no approach is uniformly successful. Because non-violence has failed in one situation, it does not necessarily follow that it is overall ineffective. So there are different ways to use non-violence, such as non-compliance, disobedience, boycotts, strikes and sanctions, rallies, marches, sit-ins, hunger strikes, and protests, just to name a few. I'll be focusing on protest and persuasion. So how does my media image fit into this category? So let's just have a look. So the act of protest in the vandalism of the army tank, it targets two audiences. Firstly, the public becomes involved in the protest, sewing knitted squares over the tank, taking photographs and posting them online, talking with their friends about the project. The project appeals to them, and subsequently they are persuaded to join the cause. The growing public involvement in the project in turn places pressure on the government to listen and respond. Wallace writes about protest as a symbolic public act. The pink knitted squares are made as symbolic objects that negate authority, and the covering of the army tank becomes a symbolic representation of public power in regards to the foreign policies and warfare. Setting the protest in a public space opens communication with a wider audience and creates unity. So art is used to protest through music and artworks that inform, persuade and empower the audience. In recent times, graffiti has become considered an effective medium to express political ideas, fight the status quo, and educate the public on important causes, conflicts and issues. Wallace discusses how yarn-bombing is powerful. It is a powerful movement. It has gained potency as a disruptive, unexpected, yet peaceful gesture, where knitting as activism sought to raise consciousness as an act of resistance. Yarn-bombing is a modern trend that has spread rapidly around the globe. It is a practice of covering objects in the public space with bright knitted coverings. It reflects a new ethic of sustainability, green thinking and gender equality. Women are using a traditional form of handicraft to protest norms, challenging ideas of subversive action such as graffiti and also male discourse. For them, according to Wallace, yarn-bombing is a constructive approach to activism that encourages interpersonal interaction and everyday resistance. This is part of a new wave in feminism, the reclamation of femininity, embracing female roles, and reframing women as powerful, competent and articulate. They are using the public space to challenge the status quo and make people question what they see and what they support. In this way, it is powerful. My media item shows what Sharp describes as engagement in symbolic protest. Women from diverse backgrounds felt united in a common cause, knitting squares and posting them from places all over the globe, even Australia and the US. The defacing of an image of war becomes a symbol of an enormous network of protesters who don't agree with the war in Iraq. So how has the Pink Tank Project caused changes in society, government policy? Has it stopped the Iraq War? Well, no, but I would argue that the Pink Tank Project was one action of many that are slowly reshaping the world into a better, more peaceful system. It is a cog in a greater machine of a non-violence ideology that is permeating our society. In conclusion, I believe that my media item shows how the emerging social movement of yarn bombing is building upon principles of non-violent action, and through protest and persuasion is affecting change. Yarn bombing is a symbolic and unifying act that has the power to change our world for the better.